The 3/11 nuclear accident, UN recommendations to the Japanese government for abandoning its citizens, NGOs and evacuees call for sincere response. Rei Shiba, freelance journalist, Environment, Human Rights, War and Peace, March 11, 2018. A giant origami crane was displayed at a study session on the nuclear accident response held on the 8th of this month. Today, the 11th, marks 7 years since the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident, March 11, 2011. To mark this occasion, a study session was held on the 8th of this month at the House of Councillors building, bringing together environmental NGOs, human rights groups, and voluntary evacuees from the nuclear accident. The study session focused on the recommendations from the UN Human Rights Review regarding the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident, as well as reports on the current situation of voluntary evacuees and the results of investigations into the still severe radioactive contamination in Nami Town and Itate Village in Fukushima Prefecture. There were repeated calls for the Japanese government to immediately implement the UN recommendations. What are the UN recommendations for responding to the nuclear accident? Contents at the UN Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review, UPR, last November. The following recommendations were made by various countries to the Japanese government regarding the nuclear accident. This demonstrates that the international community continues to be interested in and deeply concerned about Japan's response to the nuclear accident. Continue providing support to voluntary evacuees from areas of Fukushima Prefecture with high levels of radiation, including housing, financial, and other livelihood assistance, as well as regular health monitoring for those who were children at the time of the accident. Austria, apply the guiding principles on internal displacement to all victims of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident, ensuring full and equal participation of both men and women in decision-making processes regarding resettlement. Portugal, respect the highest standards of physical and mental rights of people living in Fukushima Prefecture, particularly pregnant women and children, by restoring the permissible radiation dose to 1 millisievert per year and continuing to provide support to evacuees and residents. Germany, guarantee access to medical care and services for victims of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident and generations of nuclear weapon victims. Mexico, among these recommendations, the one from Germany drew the most attention at the UN Human Rights Council, according to Chisoto Jono, Public Relations Officer for the international environmental NGO Greenpeace Japan. They were very surprised and concerned that the annual radiation exposure threshold for lifting evacuation orders was 20 millisieverts, not 1 millisievert, the annual limit set by the International Commission on Radiological Protection, or ICRP, he said. Severe contamination remains in southern Itate and Nami. UN Recommendations Study Group on Nuclear Accident Response. The Japanese government will officially announce its position on the UN UPR recommendations on the 16th of this month, but on the 5th of this month, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that it would accept the 4 nuclear power plant-related recommendations. Jan van der Putte, a radiation protection expert at Greenpeace Belgium, said, "The Japanese government has set a long-term goal of lowering the evacuation standard to 1 millisievert, and has not yet specified a deadline for this. However, since it has accepted the UPR recommendations, it should do so immediately. 7 years have passed since the accident, and radiation levels have decayed in various areas. With the exception of a few areas, it is now possible to keep annual radiation exposure below 1 millisievert. On the other hand, based on detailed surveys conducted from September to October last year, Putte also points out that radiation levels remain extremely high in southern Itate Village and the Tsushima, Murohara, Sumori, and Ohori districts of Nami Town, and evacuation orders in these areas should not be lifted. It will take until the middle of this century in southern Itate Village and Tsushima in Nami Town, and until the beginning of the next century in Ohori, for radiation levels to fall below 1 millisievert per year. Complete decontamination is difficult and the effects are limited in areas surrounded by forests. Regular monitoring in southern Itate Village showed that air doses in 2017 were higher than in 2016 in some areas. Ibid, video, returning to home 7 years after the accident. Mr. Kano's story in Nami Town, Fukushima Prefecture. Voluntary evacuees in distress due to termination of housing support. Although radiation levels are below 20 millisieverts per year, the situation of so-called voluntary evacuees who evacuated from areas with higher air doses than before the accident is also becoming more difficult. Noriko Matsumoto, representative of the Evacuation Cooperative Center and the person responsible for the evacuation, evacuated with her daughter from Koriyama City, Fukushima Prefecture, to Kanagawa Prefecture after the nuclear accident. Fukushima Prefecture's free housing support was terminated at the end of March 2017, and all voluntary evacuees are struggling to make ends meet, she said. Matsumoto noted that in many cases, voluntary evacuation is carried out by mothers and children, and many of these end up in poverty. According to a survey conducted by the Evacuation Cooperative Center, in Yamagata Prefecture, where many voluntary evacuees from Fukushima Prefecture have evacuated, approximately 70% of consultations with voluntary evacuees regarding living expenses are about money. Voluntary evacuees are eligible for support under the Nuclear Accident Child and Victims Support Act, and the Japanese government responded accordingly in response to the UPR recommendation. However, Matsumoto pointed out, to put it bluntly, the reality is that no support is being provided at all. Protect the right to health of nuclear accident victims. Failing to provide support to voluntary evacuees and not immediately lowering the annual radiation exposure limit for evacuation from 20 millisieverts to 1 millisievert, the response of the national government and Fukushima Prefecture, violates the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, the application of which was called for in the UPR recommendations, points out lawyer Kazuko Ito, Secretary General of the NPO Human Rights. Now, unfortunately, the suffering of evacuated women and children, and the voices of mothers raising children in Fukushima Prefecture, are not being reflected in politics, says Ito. Guiding Principle 15 on Internal Displacement, d. The right of internally displaced persons to be protected from forcible return or resettlement to any place where their life, safety, freedom, or health would be endangered. Ito also points out that the planned scaling back of the Fukushima Prefecture Health Survey may be inconsistent with the UPR recommendations. Prior to this recommendation, in 2015, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, Anand Grover, recommended that comprehensive health surveys, not just thyroid cancer surveys, be conducted in areas with annual radiation exposure exceeding 1 millisievert, not just Fukushima Prefecture. However, the Japanese government continues to ignore these recommendations, said Ito. Pretending to accept the recommendations is unacceptable. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant immediately after the nuclear accident. Attorney Yuichi Kato, who has been involved in various lawsuits and support for victims of the nuclear accident, said, "I am pleased that the Japanese government accepted the UPR recommendations regarding the nuclear accident." However, upon reading the Japanese government's response to the UPR recommendations, I am concerned that they will only pretend to accept the recommendations and not actually implement them. Saying that the current policies, regarding the nuclear accident, are sufficient while acting as if we have accepted the recommendations is tantamount to double-talking the international community. Now that we have accepted the recommendations, the international community will be scrutinizing us even more closely. We will continue to closely monitor and communicate whether the recommendations are actually implemented, said Kato. 7 years have passed since the worst nuclear accident in history. Remembering the nuclear accident means not only reporting related news every March, but also carefully monitoring and examining the response to the nuclear accident. As someone involved in the media, I would like to keep this in mind. End.